I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone to this webinar on land use change, leveraging high resolution data for smart climate strategies. If you come to the next slide there, Jack. I'm just going to first of all introduce your presenters today. There's myself, Richard Sheane. I'm one of the founding directors of 3Kill, specialising in land sector carbon accounting and reporting. Also from the 3Kill side, we've got Jack with me today. He's our 3Kill land use change innovation lead. He also specialises in Scope 3 decarbonisation work. And it's a pleasure to introduce our guest presenter today with us, Xavier from AdAstra. 3Kill has worked with Xavier for a few years on different projects, and when we identified that land use change was an area that we needed to get better at as an industry, they were the obvious partners to work with given their credibility in the space. So very happy to have him on the session today. Also, you'll spot Olwen, one of our principal consultants here. Olwen's going to be managing the Q&A, so please do post any questions as they occur to you during the presentation. She'll be aggregating them and we'll go through them at the end during the Q&A session. So without further ado, go on to the next slide. So just a few words about 3Kill, first of all. If you've not heard of us, we're a sustainability consultancy, and the areas of our work, we tend to specialize around 3 areas. So first of all, corporate climate, nature and circular economy strategy and implementation. Secondly, we work in depth in commodity supply chains, looking at deforestation risk commodities. And thirdly, also in agriculture. So part of our business works with farmers and growers on regenerative agriculture and other practices. So that's a little bit about us. Go on to the next slide. In terms of the sort of specific experience around land use change, we're advisors and users of all of the key greenhouse gas accounting standards that have things to say on this topic. They're very comfortable in that space. And also, as I mentioned, in our commodities practice, we do a lot of work around deforestation and conversion-free policy and implementation with businesses. So whether that's supply chain mapping, strategy and roadmaps, research and analysis, and some of our collective work around coalitions trying to shift the dial on deforestation.
Should I go, I guess, Rich?
Go for it, Xavier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rich. Hi, everyone. I'm Xavier, co-founder at AdAstra. We are a Swiss startup grounded into quantitative sustainability. Our core focus is developing scalable data solutions that help create collective knowledge around food supply chains, impacts, and risks, with a core focus on land use change, as you will see, which is the foundation for our flagship product, Orbe, which I will present in more detail a bit down the road.
Great, thank you very much. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, broadly, we've got 3 sections. We've got setting the scene, which is where I'm going to do my introduction around why land use change is important and how it's quantified. Then Jack's going to take us through some of the challenges around the current way of quantifying land use change and really why we don't see them as fit for purpose in terms of looking forward to setting targets and hitting those targets. And then finally, Xavier is going to go through the Orbe solution, which we very much see as one of the key ways of delivering better land use change data and reporting. So onto my bit. So as many of you are probably aware, land use change is a major source of emissions, especially within the food system. This is some research from a few years ago. Very broadly speaking, a third of food system impacts are relating to land use change, a third from other land management type emissions, and then a third from non-land emissions. So it's a really critical part of the overall impact of the food system globally. And the topic of land use change has become a lot more known about recently due to its inclusion in a lot of standards and target setting methods. Many of these you'll have come across as well if you're in this space. So the GHG protocol, land sector removal guidance, which is draft at the moment as a major focus around land use change. And also it's a required element of Science-Based Targets Initiative's flag guidance and net zero standard. So starting off from the basics, what are land use change emissions? So this is a definition from the Accountability Framework, which is a very credible initiative in this space. Land use change emissions are the emissions associated with the transition from one land use category to another, such as from forests to cropland. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see a very helpful matrix, which you can find in the SBTi flag guidance, which really shows the orange spaces are where land use change emissions occur. And you can see that the different categories of land use that are pre-conversion on the left, so forest land, grassland, and then the conversion to the other type of land use category along the top there. So for example, the most commonly known sorts of deforestation conversion is from forest to grassland or forest to cropland, but it also includes other sorts of conversions, so grassland to cropland, or forest to settlement or other land. So really the key message here is that all of these conversions include some sort of carbon stock loss, and they should be included in land use change estimates. It's also worth noting that there is losses from natural forest to planted forest, and from natural ecosystems to intensively managed land generally. So next slide. I think it's also worth noting that land use change is highly spatially variable. So depending on where a business sources from or operates, their exposure to land use change emissions will vary significantly, either from zero or a very high source of emissions. And so there's a little bit of a risk here around using high-level averages because the variability beneath country level is so variable. And if you're working carbon accounting, you'll be used to variability and uncertainty being common across a lot of carbon accounting work. However, it's particularly of note in land use change. And so this really underlines the importance of improving traceability and the specificity of land use change estimates. I might actually just add, sorry, on the left, this is an example from the all-based data for Brazil. So it shows the range for some states. Thank you. So very high picture from high level, how do you quantify land use change? Effectively, it involves two steps. You have your natural ecosystem as your starting point. Then there is some form of conversion event. So the first question is, how do you quantify the emissions that come from that conversion event? So the very basic example, a lot of trees are cut down. There's a certain amount of carbon dioxide that's released whenever they are cut down and degrade. So the first challenge is quantifying that carbon stock loss. And the next step is really deciding then how to allocate those emissions to crops that follow. And so there's lots of different ways of doing that, and that's what we're going to look into next. So two dominant approaches are used at the moment. You may have come across or heard mentioned. One is statistical land use change, and one is direct land use change. So these are two methods for calculating that quantity of emissions, and then how do you allocate them to crops or livestock products after the conversion. And you can see from this summary here that at the moment, both methods are possible within the standards. So on the top, you've got the flag guidance from Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It is expected that direct land use change will be preferred, instead of, there'll be a hierarchy, and direct land use change is a preference over statistical, but it's still likely that statistical will be allowed. So what I'm going to do now is talk you through those two different methods. So direct land use change. This is a very simplistic view of an example area. So we've got some crops on the left, and some forest. And as a starting point on the left-hand side, you've got 4 crops, and then there is a land use change event. You can see crop C at the top has had the 100 hectares encroached onto forest land. So this is an example of where crop C has caused direct land use change. And so if you were calculating direct land use change, you would be wanting to quantify the emissions from that forest loss and then allocate them to crop C. And so this really requires that you know where crop conversions occur spatially and also what crops were grown post-conversion. So you can do that overlay to kind of come up with a direct land use change calculation. So really in practice, this means either, you have access to farm records and farm data, so you can actually do the calculation from that information, or there is other forms of data such as Earth observation data, which you can effectively do the same thing to see where the deforestation occurred and what crops were growing there afterwards. So this is the same example, but if you notice from before, crop B is actually expanding its production in this imaginary region. And so there's an extra 100 hectares of crop B being grown. Actually, crop C is still the same area as it was to begin with. It's still, it's gained, it's lost 100 hectares and it's gained 100 hectares. So in this example, a statistical land use change approach would be looking at a regional level and still quantifying the forest loss. So we've still got the same amount of emissions being lost, but in terms of the allocation, it looks at what crops have expanded within that region. And under this example, crop B is the crop that gets the allocated the land use change emissions. So this is statistical land use change emissions. So you can see 2 different methods come up with very different answers. And typically, statistical land use change historically has been done at a country level. So you get statistical data on forest loss at a country level and also crop expansion and contraction at a country level. So I think this is my final slide. So the other key concept to think about to understand when looking at land use change is this 20-year assessment period. So whenever we have a deforestation or conversion event, that releases a lot of emissions. The question therefore is, temporarily, from a time perspective, when do you allocate those emissions? Does the first crop post-conversion get all of the emissions, or do you kind of spread it out over a period? And actually it's the convention across lots of different standards and the IPCC, etc., is to use this 20-year assessment period. So the total emissions get spread over a 20-year period post-conversion. So there are 2 options here, broadly speaking. One is what's called an equal discounting approach, where effectively every year for 20 years post-conversion, a crop gets allocated 1/20th of the total emissions. The other option is called linear discounting. And this is where crops that are temporarily proximate to the conversion event get more. And as you move away from the conversion event, crops get allocated less. And it's the linear discounting approach which is required within SBTi flag and the GHG protocol land sector removals guidance. So I think that's my last slide. So handing over now to Jack to unpick a little bit more about the challenges inherent in taking this sort of approach, these different approaches to modeling land use change.
Thank you, Rich. Excuse me. So land use change emissions are commonly calculated from 2 main sources. So the first of which is when they are embedded in emissions factors in LCA databases. So here we can see an eco-embed emissions factor for palm fruit bunch production. And this specifies that it contains land use change emissions within that emissions factor. And this is by far the most common approach for calculating land use change emissions in your greenhouse gas inventory. The second approach you can take is when you have on-farm level data about the land use change event, including what type and when it occurred. You can use a farm carbon calculator such as the Cool Farm tool, to estimate those land use change emissions. And just to note here that saying off-farm land use change, i.e. that from purchased animal feed, where you don't have farm level information on the land use change, that will use an LCA database like on the left. To use a farm carbon calculator, you need farm level information. Hence, the most common approach is using land use change embedded in databases. And so of those databases, statistical land use change is by far the most prevalent approach. And there are a few reasons for this. So one of which is because they're based on readily available statistics. So we can see here that the UN information on country level crop production, and there's also readily accessible information on country level deforestation and conversion. And you can combine these two to create a statistical land use change emissions factor. And so because this is done at the country level, they're relatively easy to apply in terms of you don't need detailed traceability data in order to calculate land use change emissions. You just need to know the country or assume which country you're sourcing from, and then you apply that emissions factor to calculate land use change emissions. And because these emissions factors are relatively easy to apply and statistical land use change is an acceptable approach in the major greenhouse gas standards, it's by far the most prevalent method used in GFLI, EcoVent, and AgriPolize. They will all use statistical land use change in their land use change emissions factors that are embedded within other emission factors. So if most land use change emissions are calculated from LCA databases, and those LCA databases use statistical land use change to calculate those land use change emissions, what are some of the limitations of those methods, especially if our goal is to track emissions reductions? So firstly, because those emissions factors are calculated at a country level, you're limited to that country level average. Even if you have regional, farm, or field level traceability, that won't change your land use change emission factor because you're stuck with that country level. And similarly, it doesn't reflect your or your suppliers' sourcing. If you source from different countries as the emission factor, as to what the emission factor assumes, that won't be reflected in your greenhouse gas inventory. A lot of the land use change emissions factor databases also don't use consistent methods over time. So this means a land use change emission factor from 2019 might not be directly comparable to a land use change emissions factor from 2024. And also the land use change emission factor databases methods don't align with the latest standards. So they often use equal discounting, whereas we know linear discounting is now the preferred approach, and their scope of land use change isn't as broad as the latest standards want it to be. And so this has some potential implications for corporate GHG, your corporate greenhouse gas inventory and accounting. Firstly, because the assumed land use change emission factor doesn't reflect your supplier's sourcing, it means your base year is often inaccurate. And then crucially, you can't reflect any deforestation and conversion-free investments that you're making, such as by buying certified commodities in your greenhouse gas inventory, because of those assumptions that are fixed within the emission factors that you're using. So this means despite the fact that you might be paying for some certified commodities, you're currently unable, using these industry methods, to reflect these in your greenhouse gas inventory. And finally, because it's not very transparent, the methodology for calculating land use change emissions buried within the LCA databases, it's often very difficult to explain any year-on-year changes in land use change emissions. Okay, so what do we need to do in order to get an emissions factor that could reflect your deforestation policies or the certified commodities that you buy, as well as aligning with best practice and making sure we keep in line with those standards and those preferred methods? So firstly, your land use change emissions factor should include all forms of deforestation and conversion. That's legal and illegal, and as well as including going beyond deforestation to include conversion of all other habitats as well. Often deforestation is just included by itself. And that also includes peat. So burning or draining of peat, which is also commonly missed out within land use change databases. And then with the deforestation and conversion-free practice policies and certified commodities that you're buying, you need to make sure that those align with the standards to make sure those can be robustly reflected within your emissions factor, within your greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So the latest draft of the Land Sector Removals Guidance, which is due to be finalised in late 2025, says that when you buy a certified commodity, in order to reflect the reduction associated with that certified commodity, it has to be in a physical, traceable system. So in real terms, that means that it's a segregated certification, or some mass balance certifications also allowed, i.e. you can't use credits to reduce your land use change emissions. And finally, we need to make sure that we account for cut-off dates properly in our land use change emissions. So a cut-off date often comes with a certification. So there's some examples at the bottom. And the cut-off date says that no land use change has occurred past that cut-off date. But if that cut-off date is within the past 20 years, because of that 20-year allocation period, there could be some land use change emissions in your emissions inventory. And we need to make sure exactly how much of those emissions to include so you reflect reductions correctly. So in summary, almost all land use change emissions are calculated via embedded emissions factors in LCA databases, and they're calculated using a statistical land use change approach. There are a few limitations to that, but crucially, you can't reflect buying certified commodities in your emissions inventory. There's no link that you're able to do that. But if we had an emissions factor that met these criteria above, then we would be able to reflect those and really improve our accounting of land use change emissions. I'm now going to hand over to Javier, who's going to talk to us about that.
Thank you, Jack. So maybe you can move to the next slide, please. So here we are. It was clearly outlined that statistical land use change is today what everybody and anybody would find and use by default in their JG inventories. And there's a reason for it. It's easy and it's pre-calculated. Direct land use change has actually been on the table for quite some years. It just was very expensive and very time-consuming and very data-intensive to operate. And what we have done over the past 3 years at AdAstra was rethinking that problem, considering the complexity of food supply chains, which always come with a blend of different traceability level, ranging from specific farms to buying stations, supplier locations, down to countries, or sometimes I have no clue. I just buy certain commodity on the marketplace, and how to navigate that complexity by running direct land use change systematically and make it easy to use in carbon accounting. And this is what Orbe does. Orbe is today the first technology and web app, open access, that provides direct land use change emission factors for multiple commodities, multiple geographies, and a variety of traceability levels. The ambition we have with Orbe is not to make it easy, but it's to create awareness around these spatial and temporal variabilities of land use change across different types of ecosystems, different commodities, understand the drivers, to empower those that are dependent and codependent on these supply chains to act collectively into stopping deforestation and other land conversion. So this is Orbe. If you want to move to the next slide, and I'll explain a bit how this works in practice. It's all grounded into Earth observation. So behind Orbe are billions of data points derived from satellite imagery, which help us to rebuild the history of every field over the past 20 years, so during the assessment period. In practice, what we do is we collect information on forest cover, on other natural ecosystems cover, over time, year after year, and then blend that with crop classification on high resolution. And if you move to the next slide, this shows that we're actually building a global model out of a truly bottom-up approach that looks at the specifics of every single site, every single field, on a resolution of 30 meters, sometimes even 10 meters, depending on the commodity, recording any change in land use over time over the past 20 years. That means we reveal which commodity has been causing deforestation or other type of land conversion, when, and automate the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions linked to that. If you move to the next slide. And why is it important to operate on such high resolution? It's because the patterns of land use change or land conversion are site specific. There are different drivers in different parts of the world. The causality and the drivers for land use change in Brazil are utterly different from those in West Africa, completely different from those in China or in Indonesia. And this is and to grasp that complexity and these nuances, you need to go super granular. And this is what we've built. It's like a gigantic data refinery that operates on high resolution. And for every single pixel of 30 by 30 meters, we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions linked to specific crops. So the greenhouse gas emissions linked to soy are different from the ones linked to corn and different from the ones linked to palm or coffee, for instance. And the interest of doing that in an automated way is that it can then be aggregated on any spatial level of interest. So from these individual pixels, we aggregate the emission factors on farm level, on sourcing region level, on jurisdictional level, that can be a municipality, a state, a county, or on country level. And this is where it's really important because it offers consistency for those who are working with that blend of traceability levels in the supply chain across commodities, across different verticals, to work with consistent data and use that as a real incentive to further work into better traceability, because from now on, you can actually match emission factors to the traceability level that's known at a certain point in time from the buyer or the seller of a certain product. If you move to the next slide, please. Of course, this is only meaningful if it's entirely in line with the accounting principles set in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So our team has been directly involved in the drafting of land sector and removals guidance land use change chapter that will be published at the end of this year. Among the many different requirements, one of them is to look at all types of land conversion. It's not just about forest, it's also grassland and shrubland conversion, wetland conversion. It's looking at all carbon stocks. That means the biomass that's outside, what we call above ground, the leaves, the branches of the trees, but also the below ground biomass and the soil in the carbon, whether it comes in a mineral or an organic form. All of this is blended. All of this is spatially and site specific and automatically consolidated into greenhouse gas emission factors from land use change per area or per volume of commodity. So it can basically be used directly for reporting under the Science Based Targets initiative. Can move to the next slide, check. All of this is new. This so-called jurisdictional land use change or jurisdictional direct land use change approach has been, you could say, theorized in the GHG protocol, but no one had applied it at scale as we did. And therefore, it was very important for us to provide transparency and credibility on all of the data sources, all of the computation mechanisms, and all of this. You will find our methodology that you can directly download from the web application. Next slide. I mentioned it. The real interest, among others, is that as companies work towards better traceability, their emission factors evolve alongside them. And this is extremely important because we've heard so many food companies telling us, hey, we've put so many millions into getting better data, better traceability, but we cannot reflect that in our land use change footprint. Now it's possible. And Orbe being an open data platform is an invitation for anyone to just pick it up. Next slide. To go that far, it required gathering a lot of data, gathering, cleaning, processing a lot of data on high resolution. Where we're at today is with a pretty broad coverage of high-risk commodities across the globe. In orbit, you will find about 90% of palm and soy production, 3/4 of corn, half of sugarcane, half on rapeseed, and some sample data for other crops like wheat, barley, cocoa, coffee, and cotton, for instance, and expanding. So the goal is really to get to a point where we have global coverage of all of the major commodities in different sourcing regions, because the patterns of land use change very drastically. It's of course a lot of the issue, a lot of the problem to be solved is about deforestation in the tropics, but not only. We also witness cases of important emissions from land use change in North America, in Florida, in China, in Australia, in different locations. And it's really important that we can operate across these commodities and geographies in a fully transparent and consistent manner. Next slide. So in the end, this is a bit how it looks like. So if you will allow me, I will quickly still the screen sharing. May I, Jack? Yeah. This will stop. Others. Okay. Oh, you should see my screen. Just to give you a sneak peek at Orbe, and I do invite you to just go to orbe.eco and create an account. It's free, and you can navigate through the data by yourself. It's just to illustrate a bit the depth of the data that's behind and the learnings you can get from it. So this is an overview of the data we have for soy. That's 17 countries in the world, 87% of global production. And this map very quickly shows what are the emission factors per ton of soybean from different origins, aggregated on country level, and very quickly shows that the patterns or the causality behind the land use change emission factors are different depending on the geography. Deforestation is predominant in Bolivia and in Brazil, for instance, but grassland conversion is very important in the US and even more important in Brazil and in China. So these are types of patterns that can be identified. You can have a very quick sneak peek to compare different originations and understanding the patterns of land conversion across different countries. Understand the variability within countries, and I'll illustrate that through a map in a minute, because it's one thing to have one value, basically a black box, as an aggregated emission factor on country level, which you would also get from statistical land use change. It's way different in terms of risk assessment to understand the variability within a country to assess the potential exposure to land use change in your supply chain. So this is what is shown here. You will also discover that such emission factors are provided for a variety of products, being soybean or processed soy into different forms like oil, meal, or biodiesel, for instance. Same thing for other crops. And last year, it's also about understanding the materiality of land use change in the bigger picture. So when you look at land use change in contrast to land management emissions, in contrast to post-farm processing emissions, well, we provide all of that information in a single place just to make your carbon accounting so much easier than it was before. And if I dive into one country, and this is the data for soybean in Brazil, this subnational variability is what you see on the map. The darker the municipality in Brazil, the higher the emission factor. And you can see on the right-hand side these parallel coordinates showing the dependency or the correlation between the land use change emission factor, the production volume, and the total land use change emission in a given place. On municipality level, on state level, you see huge variability. And this is also how you can very quickly grasp a sense of the risk of the exposure and the intensity of the emissions linked to sourcing a ton of soy, in that case, from a particular region in Brazil. So there's multiple maps, multiple things to be discovered. I invite you to do it on your own. And of course, happy to guide you if you want to know more. I will stop sharing, and Jack, maybe you can get back to the PowerPoint. Good. So here you see some examples from different countries. Another thing is land use change, by definition, it's backwards looking. So it's a snapshot at a certain point in time of the history of a certain plot of land or of a certain region over the past 20 years. What does that tell us about what should be done next? In Orbay, you will not find that answer in a very explicit manner. What we have been building in-house and in incorporation with 3Keel is this what if tool, which is grounded into the Orbay data on different resolution levels. And this allows to project the land use change emissions into the future depending on different intervention scenarios and supply chain management practices, be it different cutoff dates, different sourcing regions, different certification schemes, different growth patterns for different verticals. So all this can be blended, and this really supports the understanding of the levers that will help you achieve your targets and understand what's the gap to target and the pace at which land use change emissions will eventually fade out over the next year on the way to, for example, a 2030 SBTI target. So this is a tool that 3Keel is using to support its clients, and we're in the background supporting with data provision and interpretation. Next slide. And just to finish and emphasize a few important points, it's been said at the very beginning by Richard that land use change emissions account for about 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions of the food sector. Today, this third is a black box with very high uncertainty and a black box that doesn't give any direction as to where to act. This is what Orbay aims to unlock by going much more granular, both on spatial level and on temporal levels. It allows companies, but also non-governmental organizations, academia, and policymakers to prioritize hotspots in supply chains, to take action, to understand what will happen if sourcing patterns change, where is it that the focus should be, and finally, of course, to track progress over time as sourcing patterns change, as deforestation patterns change, which we will keep on monitoring for you. That's it on my end. I do invite you to try it out. It's out there, it's open. And I'll pass it back to Richard, I think.
Thank you. Yes. So thanks, Javier. That was great. So some takeaway messages, rather. So as we've seen, addressing land use change, quantifying it is a requirement. It can't be a zero, you can't ignore it. And it's potentially significant, especially if you're a business that sources forest risk commodities. And it does need to be included in your corporate GHG accounts and targets. So the methods that we've used for the past 10 years or so, while they were good at the time, now that we're getting really to the nub of tracking change and reporting on the impacts of policies, they're not really good enough. So really that country level statistical land use change is too coarse, and that generic industry data does not reflect your supply chain sufficiently. So it's really not kind of fit for purpose. And so really, from our point of view, direct land use change is the way forward. Getting more granular data is the goal, so we can make any of those reductions strategies more grounded in reality, and also any of those claims as well, especially if they're around the deforestation and conversion-free actions that are being taken by business. And these need to align to the emerging standards that are coming out later this year. So as already been said, really welcome continuing the discussion. Jack, myself, and Javier spend hours debating this topic, and it's one of those issues that has really captured our team's imagination, given its importance. So whether it's improving your corporate inventory, making that land use change numbers more representative, benchmarking deforestation conversion policies against the emerging carbon accounting standards, reviewing third-party data, so whether it's suppliers or third-party data to get our take on its alignment to best practice, or using that modeling tool that Xavier presented in terms of looking more forward. How do land use change emissions look to change over time, given projections in sourcing and certification? And equally, from the AdAstra team, if you want to find out more about the platform, look at some of their pro options, and learn more about the methods and their plans for future expansion, then yeah, please do get in touch with him as well. So I think we're now heading to the Q&A section pretty much on time, which is great. So Olwen.
Yeah, thanks, Rich and Jack and Xavier. That was really, really interesting, and probably unsurprisingly, we've had a nice flurry of questions come in through the Q&A box. So I'll just start directing these to each of you in turn. There's a few where I think it'd be interesting to get a couple of your views on that. Others are more clearly directed to one or another. So firstly, a question asking, have there been any case studies comparing the results of applying the different methodologies, so direct land use change and statistical land use change, across the same supply chain? The idea being to see what the difference in the methodology means in estimate of emissions. So Rich, I'll go to you first and then maybe come to you afterwards, Xavier.
Yeah, while the others were talking, I was desperately trying to find a really interesting paper that I read a couple of years ago that did this exact thing, as far as I can remember. And the conclusion was that it did show this kind of this case of the average hides a lot of uncertainty, and so the average wasn't often correct. So yeah, so I think what I'll try and do is find that and put that into the slides, which we then post online. So that's a more kind of academic view. I don't know, Xavier, from your experience of working with businesses with this data, what's your take?
Well, so it's part of our systematic validation process to compare what you get from statistical land use change analysis and with the data we calculate on national level. And what we figure is it's a bit like comparing pears and apples, because it actually means two very different things. So we look at frontier crops and how they are biting into natural ecosystems. Statistical land use change looks at general expansion and contraction patterns and basically distributes that among different commodities. There are regions where our emission factors are higher. There are a lot of regions where they're much lower. There are regions where they're similar on country level. On some national level, there's so much more variability in the data that we calculate. You would witness that for beef, for instance, for soy, for sugarcane, where there's very high variability depending on the region. So there is no one answer to this, but yes, happy to share also if there are some particular questions around certain commodities.
Great, thanks both. Yeah, we can, just to say, we will be sharing the recording and slides. Will be uploaded to the website in a few days, and so we can ensure we include some links to these studies in that. Great. So the next one is quite a detailed question around giving an example of accounting for mass balance land use change free parts in an inventory. Rather than trying to work through this actual quantified example that's given in the Q&A, I think rather I'll just pose the question around how is it possible to use a mass balance chain of custody approach to reflect a kind of deforestation and therefore land use change free and therefore lower emissions in an inventory. So Rich, I'll send that one to you.
So we're sort of being driven by the land sector removals guidance and their developments on this. And from my understanding is that some forms of mass balance will be eligible for being essentially considered within your supply chain, so a scope 3 reduction. I think given the variability in the scheme specifics, it really requires you to get under the bonnet of the specific scheme you're looking at to really understand what level of mass balance is being applied, etc. So I think, and that's a bit of a process we've just got to go through to kind of map the kind of the definitions that are emerging from the land sector removals guidance in terms of traceability over to the scheme to see where what side of that yes or no does it land. So there's no kind of mass balance generally is where there's a bit of a grey area. So I don't know, Xavier, whether you've got any builds on that.
No, not so much more. I think you
Okay.
you nailed it. It's yeah.
But I suppose this is probably one of the most not controversial but challenging areas of accounting for land use changes, like is drawing that boundary, like where given this very kind of different requirements and controls of different schemes, like where do you draw that line?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would highlight though is the starting point, or the prerequisite to be able to account for any sort of cutoff date, whatever the chain of custody model, is having information on the temporality of the emissions in the first place. If you don't have that, there's nothing you can do. So I think this is why this temporal dimension is extremely important in that respect.
Yeah. Which tees up the next question perfectly, which is, what is the temporal resolution of the land use change emissions data in Orbey? So basically, does it account for emerging deforestation frontiers? I know you briefly touched on this frontiers point before, but yeah, if you could.
Yeah, so in Orbey, you'll find data that's representative of assessment year 2023. That means looking at the 20 years time window before 2023. So that's 2004 to 2023. So that answers that part of the question. Then the time increment we use to run the computation are annual increments to understand year-to-year change. So we're not monitoring monthly changes, such as what you could do with near real-time remote sensing, for instance. It's a different use case. When it comes to the temporality of updating these data, it is likely not to be on an annual basis, because there is actually very marginal change year to year, because there's still this 19 out of 20 years that you keep on inheriting from one year to the next. So we might do that for high-risk commodities in high-risk regions, but generally speaking, the data is say valid and accurate for a few years, and it's more when there's substantial improvements in the methods, in the available data, that it justifies recomputing for a new assessment. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. A couple more on Orbey then. We have, how can we aggregate Orbey's data points at a province level or eco-invent geography level?
Yeah, so if you go to Orbey, you can directly visualize, but also download the data on national and subnational level. So if you're looking at a particular province or municipality, you can just take it and plug it into your software or calculation spreadsheet. When it comes to eco-invent in particular, then you would need to modify the eco-invent inventory to plug that in. This is not necessarily straightforward. But we're looking at facilitating that with them.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question here. Did the attendee understand correctly that Orbey identifies which commodity has caused deforestation?
Yes, correct.
Great, simple answer and good news. Does the emissions factor, I think this is in referring again to Orbey as I understand it, does the emissions factor take into account secondary drivers of deforestation? So applying emissions to soy when this has been planted on land that was originally cleared for cattle?
Yeah. So this is a very good one. The simple answer is no. The long answer is a bit more complex than this. The GHG protocol says look at an assessment year and attribute all deforestation from the past to whatever is grown in that particular year. So this is what we do. So inherently, historical changes of land use between livestock and different crops are not accounted for. There's no allocation over time in that sense. However, when you look at it on the landscape level, you will see that that when there are crop rotations, the general area of corn versus soy in the US, for instance, of course, each field changes year to year, but the average area remains more or less the same. And what's important is to understand the general expansion of both corn and soy rather than individual crops. And this is, of course, captured.
Okay, great. So a specific question here, someone asking if they have the geolocation data of their own fields, can they use that to prove that it is 20 years land use change free and exclude emissions from land use change? Or I guess this is quite linked to the indirect land use change point coming up again, but basically I think the answer you've just given will help answer this one, that it would be a yes, but the other option being if indirect land use change is going to be attributed to those fields and therefore this method wouldn't hold.
Yeah, so presumably if you have a farm geolocation and you know it's in a particular jurisdiction and you see an Orbe that in that jurisdiction there has been no land use change linked to a certain commodity over the past 20 years, then you could take this as a rather confident proof point that your farm has not been a vector of deforestation or land use change. It's very rare that an entire jurisdiction has zero land use change. It does happen, of course, but it's not the rule. It's more of the exception. So for farm level direct land use change assessment, this is something that we offer as a service. That we offer as a service also in partnership with 3Keel. So if you have farm geolocations, mill locations, supplier geolocations, basically any traceability level can be analyzed using the exact same framework. It's just that it's not automated on the platform.
Brilliant. Great. So another Orbe question while we're on the role of them. It's saying Orbe is free Orbe is free, but can I use it in our accounting for free? Can you just download it?
Yeah, totally. You're most welcome to use it in your accounting, to use it for advisory. The only thing you're not allowed to do is to plug it in a commercial software solution.
Great. I think, is it one note on the what if tool being slightly different on pricing model?
Yeah, the what if tool is a separate tool that we can customize and tailor to particular needs on our end. And there's a more generic, I would say, transversal version of it that is in the hands of Rich and Jack that have customized it for the particular use cases of 3Keel's clients. So depending on your situation, you can either work directly with Jack and Rich on that. If you need a customized version of it, we're happy to support you.
Great. Okay. So now, switching back over to the 3Keel team, interested to hear your views on this question. So given that certification can provide a number of safeguards across multiple environmental and social impacts, is there a risk that GHG protocol approach for emissions estimates using the 20-year cutoff disincentivizes the purchasing of certified commodities? So quite a big question here, a little more philosophical, but interested to hear your thoughts both.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of debates internally around, the sort of somewhat artificial carbon accounting rules, which are quite black and white in terms of these rules. 20-year assessment, it's an inventory, so it's linking, direct emissions to you in that year. That doesn't say anything about the broader benefits and incentives, and so I guess what's the answer to this? There is a risk that some of the accounting rules do disincentivize some investment, I would say, and that's a balance that we're trying to navigate ourselves. Is how do you do carbon accounting and reporting responsibly, but also don't undermine good investments in schemes. So yeah, it's a challenge. I don't know if any other thoughts from the team on how to square that circle.
Yeah, I think there's, from my point of view, there's sort of two parts to this question. I guess the fairness of that 20-year allocation approach, but obviously we can debate that internally, but whether we like it or not, that is the approach that we have to take in terms of if it was 100 years, how would that change, or historical deforestation taken into account, etc. But that is sort of what we've got, so that's what we have to deal with when we do our carbon accounting. And then I think whether it's disincentivizing purchasing certified commodities, I'd say pre-Orbe, when it wasn't possible to link any certified commodity to your greenhouse gas emissions, then there was, from a carbon point of view, very little to no incentive to purchase that certified commodity. And that's sort of what we'd seen previously with our clients. But now that you can link using Orbe and the What If tool, the certification of that commodity to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, I think that will really help to improve the uptake on certified commodities as people really see the carbon benefit of that, sort of add to the motivation in purchasing certified commodities.
Great. Thank you both. There's, I think, two more that I'd like to try and get to if we have time. So one attendee has said they've recently played around with Orbe. They think it's very impressive. They've also looked at Eco Event, and in Orbe they've only seen positive land use change factors, but they saw some negative land use change in impacts in Eco Event, for example, in Brazil. And just wondering if there's an explanation for that, Xavier.
Yes, that's an artifact of older modeling principles in carbon accounting, where basically where you had a transformation from a grassland ecosystem to a perennial cropping systems, like coffee, for instance, you would account for the carbon removals into the coffee trees. According to the updated greenhouse gas protocol, you should not do that. You can account for removals, but separately, and never stack them with your emissions. So this is something that EcoInvent we know is working into solving.
Thanks. So final one then, I think so. Do you have suggestions for a similar approach for timber and paper? We have FAO stat data, etc., but we find that paper mills generally have very little knowledge, and direct land use change is not easy to calculate.
This is an interesting one, I think, because it's a bit of a gap, really, I feel. I think looking at EcoInvent, they all assume sustainable forest management as an example. So yeah, you're right. We haven't seen any forestry product land use change type numbers. I don't know, Xavier, have you?
So this definitely comes with challenges. We actually have a workflow in mind to get that done. The first of these types of products that we know we can run a similar analysis on is rubber. There is sufficient data on rubber to run these types of analysis. When it comes to pulp and paper, it's more challenging. It requires different types of forest classification. So that's in our goal is first to expand into more agricultural commodities, and hopefully next year we'll have the capability to expand onto forestry products.
Brilliant.
Stay put.
Okay. Yeah, stay tuned. That's a nice hook at the end to everyone to keep following Orbe's work. I think we're going to wrap things up there. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully you found the session useful. As said, we will be sharing slides and recording with those who registered, and they'll be available on the 3Kill website. Please do get in touch with the team if you want to keep this conversation going. We're really keen to hear the challenges you're facing currently and how we can work with you to solve those. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.